The night my husband came home at 2:47 in the morning, I was already awake. I'd been awake for an hour, actually, sitting at the kitchen table with a cold cup of chamomile tea and the particular kind of dread that doesn't have a name. Not worry, not fear. Something older than both. The kind of feeling that lives in your stomach and refuses to explain itself. I heard his truck in the driveway, heard the engine cut, heard nothing for almost 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the microwave before the back door opened and he stepped inside smelling like pine sap and something else I couldn't place. Cold water, maybe. The outdoors at night. "Couldn't sleep," I said. He startled. Just barely, but I caught it. 5 years of marriage teaches you a person's startled face the way it teaches you everything else. Slowly, then all at once. "Babe." He pressed a hand to his chest. "You scared me. Where were you?" He said he'd driven out to clear his head. Said work had been grinding him down. Said sometimes he just needed the road. He poured himself a glass of water, kissed my hair, and went upstairs. I sat at that kitchen table for another 20 minutes. Looking back now, I think some part of me already knew. Not the specifics. I didn't know anything yet, not really. But that feeling in my stomach had been there for 3 months, quiet and persistent as a stone. My mother always said intuition is just pattern recognition your brain hasn't caught up to yet. I used to think that was too clinical a way to describe something that felt so much like a ghost. Now I think she was right. I married my husband when I was 28. We met at a friend's birthday party in Austin. He'd just moved there for work, and I'd lived there my whole life, and somehow that gap between us felt charming instead of cautionary. He was the kind of man who knew things. History facts, wine, which highway to take, which restaurant had the good parking. Solid, grounded. I'd been with enough unmoored people by then to find that genuinely attractive. My father loved him. That mattered to me more than I ever said out loud. My father is a retired electrician who lives 40 minutes outside the city in a house he built himself. Not metaphorically, actually built with his own hands over the course of 3 years in his early 30s. He has a workshop out back full of tools he can name from memory and a vegetable garden that he tends with the same focused attention he gives everything. He's not a man who has a lot, but he's careful with what he does have. He's been careful his whole life. When my husband started helping with his finances, just taking a look, make sure everything's in order. My father was grateful. He's 71. He doesn't love paperwork. He trusted his son-in-law. I trusted my husband too. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday in late March. I was looking for my husband's insurance card because I needed to add it to a form for the dentist. I went through his nightstand. He knew I did that. It was never a secret. And in the back of the drawer, under a crumpled CVS receipt and 2 dead batteries, I found a piece of paper that had been folded 4 times into a small, tight square. I almost put it back. I almost didn't open it. It was a piece of regular notebook paper, the kind with the blue lines, and it had my father's signature written on it 11 times. Not a copy, not printed. Written by hand 11 times, each one slightly different from the last. Some pressed harder, some slanted further right, like someone practicing. I stood there in my bedroom at 11 in the morning and I felt the floor tilt. I put it back exactly where I found it. Refolded it, put the receipt and the batteries on top, closed the drawer, went downstairs and stood in front of the kitchen window for a long time, watching a bird work at the feeder in the backyard until my hands stopped shaking enough that I could think. My father had a small brokerage account. Not significant by most people's standards, but significant to him. Money he'd put aside over 40 years of working, meant to cover his final years without burdening anyone. He'd mentioned to me once, in passing, that he and my husband had discussed reorganizing the account, consolidating it somewhere with better returns. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. I started thinking about it now. I didn't say anything to my husband that night, or the next night, or for a week after that. I went back to that drawer 6 days later, and the paper was gone. What I did instead was call my father's bank. I told them I was helping my father update his contact information, and I needed to confirm the account holder name. They confirmed it. Then I asked if there had been any recent changes to the account. There had. A beneficiary change filed 3 weeks prior. I was having coffee at the counter. I asked who the new beneficiary was. There was a pause, and then a very careful explanation that they couldn't share that information with me since I wasn't the account holder. I called my father immediately after. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does. "Hey, sweetheart, Dad. I was in my car, parked in a grocery store lot. Did you make any changes to your investment account recently? Your brokerage?" Silence. "Dad, why are you asking me that? I just need to know." Another silence, longer this time. Then, "Your husband helped me update a few things. Said there were some tax advantages." I signed what he put in front of me. "You know I don't understand that stuff, honey." The grocery store parking lot blurred a little at the edges. When? February, I think. Maybe early March. My husband had put those papers in front of my father in February. He'd been practicing my father's signature as early as this March. "Dad," I said carefully, "don't mention that I called." "Why not? What's going on? I just need a little time. Please." He trusted me. He said okay. For the next 2 weeks, I became a person I didn't recognize. I started going through things. Not frantically, carefully, methodically. The way you do when you know you only have one chance to do it right. I went through his email on the shared laptop we'd used for years, the one with the password he'd never changed. I went through statements. I photographed documents. What I found was worse than the signature practice. My husband had been siphoning money from my father's account for 8 months, small amounts at first, 400 here, 600 there, and then larger ones. Transfers to an LLC I'd never heard of, registered in Nevada, under a name that wasn't his but that used his initials. I found filings. I found correspondence. I found a wire transfer receipt for $42,000. $42,000 from a 71-year-old man who built his own house and grew his own tomatoes and never once asked anyone for anything. I cried in the bathroom that night with the fan on so my husband wouldn't hear me. I cried until I was empty, and then I washed my face and went to bed and lay 6 inches away from the man I'd been married to for 5 years and stared at the ceiling. He put his arm around me in his sleep. He always did that. I didn't move. The morning I found the second folder is the morning everything changed. It was a Saturday. My husband left to play golf at 8. He went every other weekend, had for years. I'd never questioned it. I watched his truck pull out of the driveway and waited 15 minutes, which felt like the right amount of time to be sure he was actually gone, and then I went to the garage. There was a filing cabinet in the corner he'd always called work stuff. I'd respected that because I respected his privacy, which I now understood had been a profoundly useful arrangement for him. The bottom drawer was locked. I spent 20 minutes finding the key. It was in the pocket of a winter jacket he hadn't worn since January, inside a small zipper pouch with a gas station loyalty card and a receipt for a storage unit. A storage unit. 40 minutes away, rented under the Nevada LLC. I photographed the receipt. Then I opened the filing cabinet. The folder inside was labeled in my husband's neat handwriting, with my father's full name and a string of numbers that turned out to be his Social Security number. Inside were documents I can only describe as an alternate reality. A paper version of my father's financial life rewritten to route everything through my husband's hands. A revised will template, a power of attorney document, both with my father's signature at the bottom. Neither one was the real thing. I knew my father's handwriting. I'd been seeing it my whole life, on birthday cards and grocery lists and the notes he'd tuck into my lunchbox when I was 8 years old. These weren't it. I took photographs of everything. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I locked the drawer, returned the key to the jacket pocket, and drove to my father's house. He was in the garden when I pulled up. That's where he always is on a Saturday morning, in his old canvas hat and the rubber boots he's had since before I was born. He looked up when he heard my car and raised one hand in that, quiet way of his, and I had to sit in the driveway for a moment before I could get out. I told him everything at his kitchen table, the same one we'd sat at for Sunday dinners my whole childhood. I showed him the photographs on my phone. I watched his face move through disbelief, and then something that looked like shame, which broke my heart, because none of this was his fault. He seemed so certain, my father said, finally. He had all these documents, explained it all so well. That's how it works, I said. That's the whole point. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "What do we do?" I told him I'd already started looking into attorneys. What I didn't tell him yet was what I'd done 2 nights before, when I couldn't sleep and couldn't lie there anymore. So I'd driven to that storage facility at midnight, with the address and the gate code from the receipt. The unit was a 10 by 10 space-stacked floor to ceiling with file boxes, all labeled, all organized in my husband's meticulous handwriting. They weren't just my father's documents in there. There were 7 other names. I need to explain something about the next 2 weeks because I think without it, the rest of this doesn't make sense. I did not fall apart. I want to be clear about that, not because it makes me impressive, but because I was raised by a man who, when a pipe burst and flooded the whole back half of his house the winter I was 12, put on waders and started bailing water into buckets. He didn't call someone first. He didn't stand there. He just started solving the problem with whatever he had. I started solving the problem. I found an attorney through a referral from a woman at my gym whose family had dealt with elder financial fraud 2 years ago. The attorney, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the calm of someone who has seen exactly this before, looked at my photographs for 45 minutes and then looked at me. "You've been thorough," she said. "My father worked 40 years for this money." She nodded. "We're going to need to move before he realizes you know." We did. The storage unit documentation, the financial records, the beneficiary change, the forged power of attorney. We packaged everything together with statements from my father and filed simultaneously with the county DA's office and a civil fraud claim. My attorney had worked with the detective on the case before. She said he was good and methodical and wouldn't move until he had everything he needed. He agreed. He waited until the case was airtight. My husband was on the back deck, grilling chicken the afternoon. The detective knocked on our front door. He was wearing his old college t-shirt and listening to a podcast, and he'd asked me 20 minutes earlier if I wanted coleslaw or salad. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the detective read him his rights. I don't know exactly what I expected to feel. Something clean, maybe. Something like relief. What I actually felt was the particular sadness of looking at someone you used to love and seeing them clearly for the first time and understanding that the person you thought they were was never quite real. The man on the back deck, turning pale in his college shirt, had been doing this for years, carefully, methodically, to old people who trusted him. He had 7 other names in that storage unit, 7 other families. My father was not the first. He may not have been the last if I hadn't been awake at the kitchen table that night with a cold cup of tea and a feeling I couldn't name. The part people don't tell you about the aftermath is how administrative it is. There are hearings. There are continuances. There are forms to fill out and calls to return and meetings to sit through where you have to repeat the facts in careful, unemotional language while something inside you is still not fully convinced this is your life. My husband's attorney asked for delays. He got some. These things always take longer than they should. In the meantime, I moved out of our house and into an apartment 2 miles from my father. My mother had died when I was 19, so it had always been just the two of us, and those months of living close to him again. Coffee on his porch on Sunday mornings, watching him in the garden, eating dinner at that kitchen table, were the part of all of this that felt, somehow, like a gift inside the wreckage. He never said he was sorry. I mean that as a compliment. My father isn't a man who apologizes for things that aren't his fault, and this wasn't his fault, and he knew I knew that. What he said instead, one evening when we were watching the news and a story came on about financial crime and he clicked the TV off, was, "You know, I built that whole house by myself, and I was never scared, not once. But those papers made me feel like an idiot." "You weren't an idiot," I said. "You trusted someone. Shouldn't have trusted him." "You trusted me first," I said, "and I came through, didn't I?" He looked at me for a moment. Then he did something he almost never does. He reached over and put his hand on top of mine and just left it there. That's my father's version of a speech. The plea came 14 months after the arrest. My husband pled guilty to 2 counts of elder financial fraud and 1 count of forgery. There were 6 other victims who came forward after the case became public. Families who hadn't known what to call what had happened to them until they saw our case in the local news. 2 of them reached out to me directly. I talked to both of them on the phone for a long time. One of them was a woman in her 80s whose daughter had spent 3 years thinking it was somehow her fault. It wasn't her fault either. At sentencing, the judge read a statement from my father. My father had written it himself in the handwriting my husband had spent months trying to copy, and the judge read it slowly and clearly into the record. It was 3 paragraphs. The last line said, "I trusted this man with the savings of my working life, and he treated it like it was his to take. I want the court to know that I am not embarrassed. The embarrassment belongs to him." My husband got 4 years. His attorney called it excessive. The judge disagreed. I sat in the 3rd row with my attorney and my father on one side and the woman from the gym who'd given me the referral on the other, because she'd asked to come, and I thought that was a strange and beautiful thing to ask, and I said yes. I live alone now. That took some getting used to. The particular silence of a space that is entirely your own, with no sounds you didn't make and no schedule but yours. I used to find silence unnerving. I've been learning to find it peaceful. My father is doing well. He got most of the money back through the civil suit and the restitution order. Not all of it, but most. He planted 3 new tomato varieties this spring. He called me last week to report that the Cherokee Purples were coming in ahead of schedule and I should plan to come get some. I will. There are things I've thought about a lot since all of this happened. I've thought about the version of myself who didn't find that paper in the nightstand, who looked at it, didn't understand it, and put it back, who kept making coffee and booking dentist appointments and lying next to someone who was robbing my father and didn't know. I was that person for 8 months. For 8 months, the thing was happening and I was right there and I didn't see it. I've made my peace with that. Mostly. What I keep coming back to is not the betrayal, not the fraud, not the forgery, not any of the mechanics of what he did. What I come back to is that piece of paper. Those 11 signatures on a piece of notebook paper, folded 4 times in the back of a nightstand drawer. He was sitting across the breakfast table from me every morning and practicing my father's name. I think about that more than anything else. What it takes to do that. What you have to have made of yourself inside to sit there with your coffee and your cereal and practice forging an old man's name before you go to work. I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure there is one. What I do have is a Sunday morning every week at a kitchen table that's been in my family for 30 years, and a cup of coffee, and my father in his canvas hat moving slowly through his garden, and the knowledge that when it mattered, when the feeling in my stomach finally spoke loudly enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore, I listened. I picked up the paper. I looked at what was on it. I didn't put it down. That's the part I'm proud of. Not the investigation, not the attorneys, not the court date. Just that. The moment in my bedroom with the folded paper when I could have told myself it was nothing and walked away. I didn't walk away, and my father still has his house.